before we begin our program, Jeff, we have a new custom. We have a tidbit about the area every morning of our meeting from Jeff Megan.
Thank you. This is a new program, and I don't mean to take it over entirely if anybody wants to volunteer, but every morning of our meeting we decided to have a tidbit which sort of ties the three communities. Whoops, wait a minute. It's not the three communities. It's the village of Larchmont, the town of Mamaroneck, and the village of Mamaroneck, and that dangling participle Mamaroneck, which is appropriate for today. And these tidbits are sort of to tie the communities together. And what physical thing ties these communities together? Well, Long Island sounds that's a good one, Norm. I got an expert over here. The Post Road, Route 1. You know, so let's start. The Post Road obviously goes from Florida to Boston, and in the old days it had a lot of inns and restaurants and places to spend the night. So we have a few of them, and some are old and some are within our memory. So let's start down in the border of Larchmont and New Rochelle. Oops, I can't say that. It's the border of New Rochelle and the town of Mamaroneck, because we have that sliver that goes all the way down to Premium Point, and down there you don't know whether you're in the city of New Rochelle or the village of Larchmont or the town of Mamaroneck. God bless you. So starting down there where Staples is, who knows what inn was there? Loyal Inn, attaboy. When I was a kid, and Norm will remember this too, I remember looking out my bedroom window and seeing the entire sky orange, because the Loyal Inn burned to the ground. It was one of the biggest fires we ever had. And then for years we had the Loyal Inn bowling. So going up the street, and of course, if we leave the town and go into the village of Larchmont, so the village of Larchmont really didn't have much on the Post Road. They had 3 hotels in the manor, and they were the Bevan, Victoria, Royal Victoria, and the Manor Inn, which was not the Manor Inn, it was called the Belvedere. Okay? And of course, the Royal Victoria burned. That was another big, huge fire. The Bevan got whittled down to a house, but I can remember when it was a great cellar bar for the neighborhood. And of course, the Manor Inn got whittled down into a couple of houses. Going up the street, we have the infamous Larchmont Motel, and the town of Mamaroneck folks would remember. It sort of was the pharmacy for the Hummock School, so to speak. Shortly up the street, if you remember, we had a great group along the Post Road, which is now all gone with now box stores. But the first place is Castro Convertible, and we all remember Bernadette. Now, what was that? No, before that. It wasn't Castro Convertible, early on. That was another one of the famous inns. That was Time. Yeah, Red Lion Inn. Okay. Actually, I'll stop there. And the next time I'll go further up until the city of Rye. So, and if anybody wants to volunteer for these tidbits, please.
Thanks.
Bravo.
Thank you, Jeff. Sorry. Thanks, Jeff. Jeff was born and raised here, so he's one of those people that's a font of local information. Most people who run for office not only want to obtain that office, but retain it. We have here this morning someone who is making a proposal that will actually do himself out of an office. We're going to hear this morning about that proposal, the dissolution of the town of Rye, from the supervisor of the town of Rye, and from Norm. From George Latimer, but they'll be introduced by Carolyn Pomerantz.
Thank you so much. Welcome Steve Otis, our assemblyman.
I'm sorry.
I have congratulations. I have the distinct honor to introduce someone who everyone in this room knows. So it's kind of difficult for me to come up with words that, that would tell you something about George that you don't know. However, because of the conversation that we're having today on the Rye-Town dissolution and the history of this area, I'm going to remind him of a conversation years ago, it might have been almost a decade ago, when I wanted to understand the dynamics of all these municipal boundaries and all the history of it. And he took out a napkin, and I think we continued the conversation on the back of one of these placemats. And I have to say, it was the best description of what the scenario is and the historical basis for it that I've ever heard. So that's why I've asked George to be here today. And as of last month, I do want to give you a little bit of an introduction just to remind you of his background, because it does come into play a little bit in what he's talking about today. As of last month, was it last month? Yeah. He became New York State Senator. Congratulations for the 37th District. The district somewhat represents, I guess, a splattered paint stain with tentacles reaching as far north as Bedford and Katona, parts of Katona, and going as far west as Bronxville, Tuckahoe, even parts of Yonkers, and parts of New Rochelle. And if I could spend an hour just trying to describe the different towns in his district, but most importantly, all of the areas that we're talking about today, Rye Brook, Rye Neck, Mamaroneck, Mamaroneck Village, Portchester, this Rye, all of it is part of his district. So that makes it relevant for him. George got his undergraduate degree from Fordham and a master's in public administration from NYU's Wagner School. I think that's going to help him dissect all of this. He's got the good background for it. He's worked over 20 years in the private sector as a marketing executive for companies we have heard of, like IBM and AT&T and Nestle. Started out his public service career in Rye City Council in 1992. And of course, last week when there was the swearing in for Steve Otis in the chambers at Rye, he pointed to the chair that he used to sit on with some fondness. So I think that stays with him as well. Then he was for 13 years in the Westchester Board of Legislators. And I knew he was the chairman of the Board of Legislators. He rose to that position. But what surprised me, and I didn't realize it until I read his bio, is he was the first Democratic chair of that board in Westchester history, which I hadn't known. And he was proud of the fact that property taxes decreased while he held that office by nearly 7% in several years. So anyhow, flash forward 2004, he was elected to the New York State Assembly. And I have to say, from my own view as a constituent, that he really was a man of his own principles. He was not in lockstep with his party, nor in lockstep with what everyone told him he should be doing. Got a little bit of gruff from some of the higher-ups because of that, but I think he earned the respect of most all his constituents, and I think that regardless of the fact that he also authored over 20 new laws, is something that we'll remember from his time in the Assembly. He was born in Mount Vernon, which I have to mention only because I was too, and I think that kind of alters your DNA a little bit, so I just wanted to throw that in. And I have to say that, he is someone that we all respect and admire in our communities because he seems to be everywhere. He could be at your neighborhood picnic. He could show up at your, service club's annual dinner. He could be here at the Nautilus Diner at any given moment, and we appreciate everything he does, for us as now our state senator. And I now yield the floor to State Senator, the Honorable George Latimer.
Thank you very much. The defining reality of that resume does look like I could hold on a job. Bouncing from one to the other. My job today is to be the eighth inning setup man Joe Carvin's job is to be the closer to discuss in the ninth inning the proposal that he has on the table. Ultimately, whatever comes out of the discussion that Joe is going to share is going to be decisions made by voters in each of the different affected areas. And then out of that process as well, it will require state legislation, which Steve Otis, as Assemblyman, and myself as State Senator, would be responsible to file and advocate for. So this is a long process that begins with discussion of where we are. But my job here, the eighth inning job, is to give you an idea of how we got to the place we got to. And it's a confusing place that we're at. Unless you were born here and somehow was a student of local government, which very few, even native people are, it's a confusing combination of names and structures. And as Carolyn said, I grew up in the city of Mount Vernon. And my father worked in the village of Mamaroneck at Beach Point Club for his years of work. I have relatives buried at St. Mary's Cemetery, which is in Portchester, but when my mother would take my sister and I to come and see the grave sites, we'd get off at the Rye train station, and we'd walk up Purchase Street, 4, 5, 6 blocks to the cemetery. And as a person who didn't grow up in this area, and as a kid, you would ask questions that were very simple. Why is this called this? Why is this called that? My mom, who's a factory worker, had no idea. So years go by, I wind up moving to this area of the county, and I run for public office. I was a councilman in Rye City, and I had to study why was there a Rye Neck, a Mamaroneck Village, a Larchmont. I mean, who's the Marquis de Sade that planned this? So my job is to try to rationalize that for you today, so hopefully you can understand what the new structure of it is. First off, I'm going to give out some maps. I don't think now I have enough for everybody. I thought I had about 40 there, so you may have to share a little bit if we run out of it. But Jeff was taking us on a trip down memory lane. I'm going to start the trip a little earlier because I want you to understand a couple of important principles. The first important principle is the systems of government we have today evolved. There were structures that were created that were perfectly logical, and the patterns of people where they decided to live and how they decided to organize themselves got us to this point by evolution, not by an immediate diktat. The second thing I want you to understand is that everything that we could be talking about going forward has had some example before. We'll talk about secession of a village from a town. That's happened already in this area. We'll talk about two governments coming together to form a city. That's happened already in this area. And so each generation looks at the structures of where they live, and they determine how that meets their current situation today. Now, somebody who moves into Mamaroneck and finds out that they live in the town of Mamaroneck but not the village of Mamaroneck. Somebody moves into Larchmont, post office of Larchmont, finds out they actually live in the town of Mamaroneck, not in the village of Larchmont. Somebody who moves to Mamaroneck and finds out they live in the town of Rye, and they have to go to Pearl Street to do something rather than to 740 West Boston Post Road. For them, all of this is illogical, and oftentimes they blame the politicians for this. If you ever go on any of the blogs, Linda Lamont has a blog, Linda Larch, those of us who read that one, constantly people go on, they're all anonymous, the politicians they want this way, this is what they want. Here's the real reality of it. And as you look at the map, consider that you're coming from England and you're deciding to live in the New World. As you reach the shores of Long Island Sound, there are no interstate highways, there are no dotted line jurisdictions. The transportation route you have is water. And so when they granted towns, which along with the county governments are the oldest governments, keep that in mind. Before there was the United States of America, and before there was a legal state of New York, there were towns and there were counties. So when we talk about get rid of the town, get rid of the county, remember, those two governments precede states and the United States of America. There was a town grant for the town of Rye. It was the land between what we know as the Byram River and the Mamaroneck River. There's a river, there's a bunch of land, and then there's another river, that's a town. The town of Mamaroneck began at the Mamaroneck River, all the way down to the Stevenson Creek. The borders have changed a little bit over the years as they were established, but the Stevenson Creek divided the town of New Rochelle, which is originally what it was. And then you go further south than that, and that was the original structure. And in 1660, the town of Rye was created. 1661, the town of Mamaroneck was created. The Huguenots came a little bit later than that. They're celebrating their 325th this year. That was 1688. Now, that's ancient history to us, over 300 years ago. But for the first 100 years of these communities, there was no appreciable change because the population was still very low. And you had, at that point in time, transportation by water and by horseback. So for the first 100 some odd years until there was the United States of America, in the colonial days, the town structures were the only local government structures. And what a town government did was very minimal. It wasn't expected to provide anything like what a town service or municipal service is today. And the river-to-river reality didn't stop where people lived. And ultimately, we'll talk about it in a second when we get to the point of village organizations, people lived on both sides of a harbor. Unless, and this is all logical, unless you're living on the Delaware River or the Hudson River, which are huge rivers, hard to cross in those days, when you have a river the size of the Mamaroneck River, it's easy to ford, and people live on both sides of the river. And they have commerce and interaction on both sides of the river, and they treat themselves as one community. The next major thing that happened was not the creation of the United States of America. It was in 1840 when the railroad came through. Now, we forget that the railroads weren't there forever. When the railroad came through, we know it now as a commuter railroad. It had an element of that when it was first created. But the bottom line was the railroad did not hug the coast. So as the railroad, at some points in time, a mile or half a mile from the water, in some cases a little further in, around the railroad depots became development and population and commerce. In some places where, in the case of Mamaroneck Village, where the railroad station is walkable from the railroad station to the waterfront, the commerce connected from one end to the other. In a place like Larchmont, where the post road is about halfway between the train station and the waterfront, you wind up with two downtowns. So when the Larchmont Chamber of Commerce has their issues, they deal with a Palmer Avenue business district and a Post Road business district. Mamaroneck and Rye do not have those realities. All of that is the way people settle. Nobody created on purpose two downtowns in Larchmont or one downtown in Rye. So when you hear people say, well, you know, hold on. This is how it evolved. You were dealing with the evolution of it because of how people decided where they were going to live. Now, New York State governmental structure allows for people who live in a town, who live in a more concentrated area of the town, and who desire more services than the town provides, to incorporate themselves as a village. Not every state provides this kind of an arrangement. In some places, that concentration is independent from the rest of the county. But in New York State, you have towns, and then a section of a town, or subsequently a whole town, can be incorporated as a village to provide for themselves additional services for which only the residents of the village will be taxed. Now, if you go back to 1875 America, what concentration of population you have in the villages were matched in the rest of the town by farms. Think of going up Weaver Street, going up Murray Avenue, Fenimore Road, Old White Plains Road, Mamaroneck Avenue, North Street, Purchase Street, Ridge Street, King Street. The density of population, once you get outside of the villages, is completely different. Now, the second map I'm going to give you gives you a very rough idea of the concentration of populations as they were structured. And I want you to compare this map to the other map of towns. What you're going to see is 5 concentrations of population, 3 towns. So already you have a lack of direct matching up of where people concentrated versus where the legal governmental lines were. Now, if you go into upstate New York, you'll see towns that are roughly squared off in some cases, certainly Western New York, and it's very true when you go to the Western Reserve areas of Ohio, where the geographic center of a town, where the 2 roads cross, is the most concentrated part of the community. That's the village, and then the area outside around the village is the town outside. Here, it's completely differently structured because of the railroad and the waterfront and how that was developed. Now, the 5 concentrations you see, New Rochelle, Larchmont, Mamaroneck, Rye, Portchester. Sounds like I'm a Metro-North conductor. If you go to another part of the state, you might be in a village, and it's concentrated, and then, there's gas stations, diners, and apartment buildings, or whatever. And then as you drive outside of the community, you go through like countryside until you get to the next village. Think of going up the Hudson. I do this once in a while, and Steve may do it once in a while going to Albany. If you take Route 9 up, there's Rhinebeck, and then you go out of Rhinebeck, and then there's Red Hook. And you go out of Red Hook, and then there's the next one town as you go up the line. That structure is the way we looked like in this area before World War II. After World War II, a couple of things happened. Now we're into an era where we remember, whether you're kids remembering this or remembering it through parents of a generation, the automobile changed the way we move around. in dramatic fashion. The structure and the population of the country exploded. The baby boom generation, of which I am a proud member of as I approach my 60th year, exploded population, and all of a sudden things started to change. Let me just go back to the concentration of these populations. Since the state allows for a concentrated population to become a village, you started to have a proliferation of village organized. The first one happened before the Civil War. The village of New Rochelle was incorporated in 1857. How many of you knew that there was a village of New Rochelle and a town of New Rochelle outside before there was a city? Raise your hand if you knew that factoid. Okay, very few of us did. That's important to note because that was the most recent consolidation. Then the village of Portchester came along in 1868. It was a port community, post-Civil War. And then right around the turn of the century, the village of Larchmont was incorporated in 1891. The village of Mamaroneck in 1895, the village of Rye in 1904. The village of Mamaroneck's incorporation of 1895, and none of us here know exactly the dynamics of the argument of those days, is the single pivotal reason why we have the complications we have. Because the village of Mamaroneck, when it organized as a village, organized on both sides of the Mamaroneck River. Population was on both sides of the Mamaroneck River. That's how Norm Rosenblum can be mayor of Mamaroneck Village. And that organization of that village on both sides of the river gave you a village that straddles a town border. By the way, you've got plenty of those in New York State. You even have villages that straddle county borders, where the river divides Broome County and Delaware County, and the village of Deposit. You might wonder why I have all these factoids in my head. I wonder why too. But Darren Johnson hit 130 RBIs in 1965 for the Cincinnati Reds. You can look it up. Led the National League in RBIs. The bottom line is that New York State law permitted this, and the organization at the turn of the century, it made more sense for the people who lived on one side or the other side of Mamaroneck Village to incorporate with each other and have shared services that they paid for than they had in common with the people who lived up what we know as Old White Plains Road in a farm, or up one of the other roads in the town of Rye in those days, since it was all one contiguous town at the time. So those structures were logical at the time, and they made sense. There was also a time at the turn of the century where the village of New Rochelle and the town of New Rochelle consolidated into the city of New Rochelle in 1898. That law was signed into law by Governor Roosevelt, Governor Theodore Roosevelt. Interestingly enough, a generation later, Governor Roosevelt vetoed creating Portchester as a city. That was Governor Franklin Roosevelt, who turned down the petition for Portchester to be a city, passed the state legislature. In that consolidation of New Rochelle, and I know New Rochelle is not part of our discussion here today, but it's an important study point. Today in New Rochelle, and if I see any New Rochellians in the room, well, all of you, follow New Rochelle, it's right next door to us. New Rochelle to this day has a political battle between the north end and the south end. You'll hear it all the time. And the south end of New Rochelle is fundamentally what the village of New Rochelle was, and the north end is what the town outside the village of New Rochelle was. In 1898, very few people lived in the quote-unquote north end of New Rochelle. And that consolidation benefited the village of New Rochelle because it allowed them to tap into a larger tax base to provide services. And the people who lived in the town outside the village did not want to consolidate with the south end and become the city of New Rochelle, which for its beginning years was dominated by those who lived in what was then the downtown south end village of New Rochelle. That's turned around completely in 100 years. The population base in New Rochelle is much more north end than south end, and you will hear the argument that the north enders drive the policy of the city of New Rochelle. So what happens in one generation can be something completely different in another generation. I say those things to tell you we are where we are today, and we make the decisions today that make sense for us. But in every one of these decisions, the decision was made based on what was economically beneficial to the people who were directly affected by it. Because we'll move forward to the one example of secession. The village of Rye, where Steve and I live. If there's anybody else in the room I'm looking quickly to see, Greg Howells happens to live in the city of Rye. That was the village of Rye, incorporated in 1904, one of what was then two villages within the three villages in the town of Rye. The village of Rye determined that its future would be better served by becoming an independent city, and it was able to have the political muscle to do that in the 1940s. And it seceded from the town of Rye and became its own separate jurisdiction, the city of Rye. Steve was mayor of the city of Rye. I was a councilman in the city of Rye. And many people say, why is Rye City, Rye Town? That's why. there was a section of the town of Rye, and the residents and the leaders of the village of Rye determined that their future economically would be better served by being outside of the town, and they were able to accomplish it. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's the short story of it. So, where are we today? We're in a situation where in the last 30 years, this is like the current news, we have had people in concentrations in these communities decide what is in their best interest. The town outside the village of Portchester, the unincorporated part of the town of Rye, became the village of Rybrook in 1982. At the same time, there was a movement in the unincorporated section of Harrison that we know of as Purchase to become a village. And the folks in Harrison town leadership said, whoa, we can't let Purchase succeed and become a village and take the tax base with them, which is 287 and the big homes. So we're going to reincorporate as a town village, so you can't subdivide a town village. I hope I haven't lost you with all the gobbledygook. But the bottom line was, here's the core reason. Rybrook residents of what we know of as Rybrook decided their future would be better if they had their own independent village government rather than be part of the unincorporated part of the town of Rye. The village residents, people lived inside the section of Purchase, felt the same way. But having seen the village of Rybrook break off and become a separate entity, the overall town of Harrison wanted to stop that. And so they did by being incorporated as a town village. In every one of those cases, it goes down to a thing. I've done this a number of times. I guess, Dan, I'm going to pick on you. Would you pull out some loose change in your pocket? You're not going to have to give it to me. Just pull it out.
You take it all the time, so.
I always set myself up for that. You more than get your share back, brother. He's got about 56 cents in his pocket. I've got, well, actually, unfortunately, I got about the same amount. Let me drop the quarter out. It doesn't work if you have the same amount of money. I have now about 37 cents. You have about 60 cents, roughly, right? Do you want to merge with me?
Of course.
Oh, come on, be serious.
You're a nice guy.
Yeah, forget you. I'm going to go to you. Wise guy. I should never pick on a wise guy. No, in all seriousness, you have 60
The
cents, I've got
economic
37
interest
cents.
would be not to merge.
Right. And do I have an interest in merging with you?
Absolutely.
Okay. That is your single biggest problem with consolidation. That the entity that has the greater resources does not necessarily see the economic benefit in merging with the entity that has the least resources. You can discuss it in terms of allocation of police. If Dan has a village and I have a village and we're side by side and I have more police activity in my village or more fire activity in my village, if we merge our resources, more of the resources are going to go toward where the need is. And so there's less of a reason for him to want to merge with me, more of a reason for you to want to be independent because you have greater economic independence that's available to you. I will wrap up my conversation by saying as you look at the maps and you see that the overlay of where people live has changed by suburbanization, and now those towns outside are not farms anymore. They are relatively densely populated, and those people want local services too. And all of a sudden, the desire for local services have changed. Our society has changed. The New Deal changed it. The Great Society changed it. The baby boom generation changed it. And now when you have a young couple moving into the town outside the village, inside the village, they still want certain basic services. Those of you who've been in public office have heard the argument all the time. Why don't we do something? We want a traffic light on that corner. We want a stop sign on that corner. How come the police aren't in my area giving out tickets? They're speeding through my neighborhood. We have once a week, we have twice a week garbage pickup. Why don't we have an extra pickup during the holidays when the garbage accumulates? And in some cases, people who financially can afford to pay for additional services, who want to get the services they want to get. So that's the setup, man. We evolved ourselves to this position. It's illogical as we look at it today, but it evolved logically out of the structures of government. Now the question is, 100 years ago, a couple of communities consolidated, some communities incorporated as villages. They dealt with these issues their way 100 years ago. 100 years later, what do we do?
Okay, that was a lot to digest along with your breakfast. There was one thing that hadn't been discussed that I'd like to get back to, which is the history of coterminous efforts in this area. So maybe when we get to that point, or if you want to pick it up, Joe. My My pleasure now is to introduce Joseph Carvin, who is the supervisor of the town of Rye, a position he's held since 2007. And he must be one of the bravest people of all politicians I've ever seen, because I've never seen a politician who really wants to get rid of his own job, and he is working very hard to eliminate the position. And before I go on with this introduction, I just want to recognize a couple people that came in. The mayor of Portchester, nice to see Dennis Pillow. I didn't want to mispronounce it. Rich Slingerland from the village of Mamaroneck. Anybody else come in? Abby Katz from the town of Mamaroneck. Thank you for coming. Okay, so back to the introduction. Joe was born in Portchester. He traveled overseas for work and returned to Rye in 2002. He works as a hedge fund manager, is that correct still? With Latimer Partners in New York City, and founded several charities, which is kind of interesting. One called Building Community Bridges, a locally based organization that aims to unite the various cultures and ethnicities of Portchester. And in 2006, another charitable organization he founded was called One World United and Virtuous. Joe earned his undergraduate degree from Tulane University, his MBA from New York University. You guys both went to NYU. And his Master's of Public Administration, MPA, is from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. So Joe does live in Rye with his wife, a non-practicing attorney, and 2 daughters. Are they still home?
They're still home, yeah.
They're still home. And his son Michael lives and works in New York City. And I proudly introduce Supervisor Carvin.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. George, first of all, thank you so much for that actually quite illuminating history of our area and our region. What you did leave one little bit out, though, and that was the town of Rye for its first 70 years was part of Connecticut.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and of course, I live 500 yards from the Connecticut border, and as I look across to Greenwich taxes, they are 75% lower. I didn't make a mistake. They're 25% of the taxes. So if we pay $100 in taxes in New York State, Greenwich pays 25. 25. So when I first looked at the restructure, I thought the best thing would be just to secede from New York State and go back to our Greenwich roots. And actually, it's kind of a funny story, because ultimately, what happened, of course, the king came over, they colonized, and all of a sudden, the governor of New York State became this guy Dunnigan. Now, it just so happens my boss's name is Dunnigan. And Dunnigan takes a look at town of Rye and says, "Ooh, I kind of like that area." And he goes to the king and says, "You know what? I want town of Rye." And so they give it to him. The king says, "Sure, Dunnigan, you've got it." Now, the people of town of Rye didn't want anything. They were going to the Connecticut legislature. They fought it for 70 years. But ultimately, the king's bargain with Dunnigan won out, and that's why the town of Rye is now part of New York State. Carolyn asked me to do 3 things today. 1, tell you why we're doing what we're doing. 2, tell you where we are, what we've done, and where we are in the process is the 3rd. So first of all, why are we doing what we're doing? Well, Carolyn was very kind and talked about my background. I think, I think that George and I have talked, and by the way, I'm thrilled that we're good friends here with Steve Otis and George Latimer. They're really working hand in glove with us to try and take things forward in a way that's consistent with our constituents' wishes. Mayor Pilla, Mayor Rosenblum on the steering committee, the administrators of the steering committee. I think the steering committees work together absolutely fantastic fashion. I think we're pretty united virtually on every issue. I'll get ahead of myself a little bit, but ultimately, George talked about his 20 years of private sector experience, and I think that's made him a far better legislator having had that experience. Now, my background is in emerging markets. I've had the good fortune to live on 5 continents, and I speak 4 languages. And most of my business experience in emerging markets, and ultimately, I've seen the world around us transformed. If you think about it for a second, at the end of World War II, we really weren't competing with anybody. By 1989, when the fall of the Berlin Wall, we were competing with Europe and Japan. today, with technology and the adoption of the free enterprise system across the globe, we're competing with everybody. I've seen Brazil transform. Brazil's gone from a hyperinflation basket case to a steely competitor. China, if you think back 30 years ago, they were primarily riding around on bicycles. It's now the second largest car manufacturer in the world. Russia has become a tax haven. A free enterprise capitalist system. Gerard Depardieu, the famous French actor, decided to move to Moscow to avoid taxes. So we're operating, when you add to that the dramatic breakthroughs in technology, we're competing we're operating in an intensely competitive global economic environment. The world our children are growing up is going to be much more competitive than our world. So that's the background to what we're trying to do. Because obviously everybody in this room knows why we're doing what we're doing. Can anybody tell me what's the highest property tax county in the nation?
Westchester.
Okay. What New York State, one of the highest property tax states in the nation? What does that do? It makes us 50th in terms of a place to do business. 50th. You got New York City, the business capital of the world. We're 50th in terms of a place to do business. Number one in what? All the wrong things. Taxes and out-migration. And we all know, everyone in this, every senior in our community is struggling to meet their tax bill. Every senior. And if we don't fundamentally restructure the way we do business, the way we govern ourselves, seniors will no longer afford to be able to live here. There's no doubt about that. If you look at the New York Journal News the other day, there's a house in Mount Vernon that's selling for $200,000 that pays $20,000 in taxes. That's 10% of the value of your home. Now, let's look at our property taxes. And what is the percentage? They're creeping up. 2%, 2.5%, 3%, just for the right to live here every year. It makes absolutely no sense to own your property any longer. You're far better off renting. Let somebody else pay the burden. So unless we fundamentally restructure the way we do business, our seniors won't be able to live here, working class people won't be able to continue to live here, and much more importantly, our kids won't be able to compete going forward. Now I'm a Republican because, for a very simple reason, I think that more money kept in the private sector creates jobs, creates sustainable jobs, and more money in your pocket is better and you're better off. That's as simple. I'm thrilled that we have a much better bipartisan Democrat and Republican camaraderie here in Westchester County, New York State. I consider George and Steve friends, and we've always been able to work together very, very. George's been hugely supportive, and Steve's hugely supportive on a number of initiatives we had in the town of High, including this one. So our tax burden is unsustainable. We need to change it. We need to change the way we govern ourselves. So we sat down. Mayor Pilla's been very helpful. Mayor Rosenblum's been very helpful. We sat down and said, okay, this is the problem. Is there a way we can restructure things? Now, for Joe Carvin, I've been very clear from the beginning. I would have been just as happy to have us eliminate the village of Worcester, eliminate the village of Rye Brook, and ultimately my town of Rye reconfigure and merge with the city of Rye. Then we would have had 60,000 people, consolidated at a higher level, and my expectations, we would have saved more money if we'd done that. It would have been a more rational. I mean, when I started my career, and George has heard this before, when I started my bank career, I started Manny Hanny. Remember Manny Hanny? So when I started, there were 6 money center banks which were the biggest in the world. Manufacturers Hanover, Chemical, J.P. Morgan, Chase, Citibank, and Bank of America. Those were the 6 biggest banks in the world. Well, what happened? Manufacturers Hanover merged with Chemical, merged with Chase, merged with J.P. Morgan. 4 out of the 6 became one. If they hadn't done it, they wouldn't compete. They hadn't done it, they would have out of business. And of course, they fired people every restructuring. Now, New York State, on the other hand, as George just told you, will tell you, hasn't really restructured since the invention of the light bulb. George's historic background is a fantastic setup. We haven't restructured since the horse and buggy era. Think of all the dramatic advances in technology, and we still have 14,000 overlapping governmental entities. So ultimately, we sat down and said, okay, I would rather consolidate, try and imitate Greenwich and have a dramatic drop in our taxes. That's what Joe Carvin would have done with his corporate finance restructuring background. But ultimately, there was no real political will for that. There was no political will. There was no way the city of Rye was going to merge was Rybrook and Portchester. There's no way Rybrook, was just incorporated in 1982, was going to unincorporate. So he said, unlike Washington, they said, okay, let's work together and let's see what's feasible. What can achieve. And so ultimately, as I say, the steering committee's been absolutely terrific. Rybrook, Portchester, the Village of Mamaroneck, we came together. We did, by the way, offer to the town of Mamaroneck to participate. The town of Mamaroneck decided not to participate from the very beginning, but we did offer to have them participate in our study, absolutely. I'm sure we'll confirm that. They took a different view, and I'm sure we'll have some conversation later. So we sat down and said, okay, what can we do? And so Mayor Pilla wrote the proposal. It was very helpful. Mayor Rosenblum and Mayor Feinstein, we came together with the village administrators, and we put a proposal to New York State to secure funding to study the elimination of the dissolution of the town of Rye and increased sharing of services. And we were fortunate to get a $60,000 grant, and then we added money from each of a couple of the villages. Town of Rye added $5,000, Portchester added $5,000, I think the village of Rybrook did as well. So $65,000, actually $50,000 grant. And we studied. Now I have to say, I believe this study's been a success already. If we're generating this kind of conversation today with this kind of interest, then I think we've achieved our first goal. Is we have to really think about how we govern ourselves. We have to really think about restructuring the way we govern ourselves. Second point is, it was an absolutely fantastic study. I think if no one can argue that this study, you should get a copy. In fact, I don't know if Carol wanted. You know, it's a fantastic study. It really describes municipal service. I think we're all honest, I know I did, learned about the services the town provides and across the board. So we learned an awful lot from the study. CGR did a fantastic job. And what they concluded is that if we do dissolve the town of Rye, each of the communities will be a little bit better off from a tax perspective. And there's some numbers in there, I think. On an ongoing basis, the village of Rybrook saves about $3 per capita. So not a lot of money. I think Portchester, Dennis, I can't remember, it was a couple $100. And then Rybrook, Mamaroneck was about a couple $100. But the second part of the study was shared services. And I think we're all agreed if ultimately once you dissolve the town, the surviving entities begin to share services, use that opportunity to begin to share services, and they're already starting to do it more aggressively, there's further opportunity for savings. And finally, as George talked about, you eliminate a layer of government. So this triple layering of government goes down, so you eliminate a layer of government. So the study is there, it makes sense, I think. We're fully supportive, I'm fully supportive of dissolving the town. I think it makes sense, it's an important first step. And I think what the real reason for me, I'm supportive of it, the rationale is we're approximating the consolidation I would have liked to see. So once you dissolve the town, you lose a layer of government. And all of a sudden, you get certain benefits already, you distribute the assets of the town of Rye. But the third thing is, once you start to share services, you can approximate to say, and retain home rule. So you get your cake and eat it too. So you can basically effectively eliminate the town and have the governments work together in a way that preserves home rule for the people of Rybrook, the people of Portchester, and the people of the village of Mamaroneck. Now, we've had a number of public hearings, and that's why I came here today. Every one of us is fully committed to hearing from the public. This is not going to be imposed on anybody. And I know, again, Steve Latimer, Steve Otis and George Latimer are...
Just merged us.
Hey, that's actually not bad.
Very good. Did you get Richard?
Won't allow us to impose anything on anybody. So we have an ongoing public conversation. Each of the boards is having public hearings and hearing from their constituency. We're going to have a number of, continue to hear from the public. There's a website. You can contact us, contact your local officials. We want to hear from you. And I think early February, mid-February, we're going to, hopefully the steering committee will meet and then make a formal recommendation to Steve and George. And ultimately try and move forward and see if we can't get the legislature to approve some sort of home rule legislation, which then would do what? So if we move forward, what's got to happen? Each of the municipalities has to vote in favor of this proposal. So the Village of Mamaroneck, Village of Portchester, Village of Rybrook, the Town of Rye, each of their boards have to vote in favor of that proposal. And if we do that, then the idea would be to go to the legislature and see if we can't get home rule legislation that puts this on a ballot in November. And then if approved, we'd have a year to execute. So if this all were to work out, this wouldn't happen until January 1, 2015. So you still have a lot of time to comment, give us feedback, get back, and then ultimately, the things move forward, as I say, 4 different votes, a vote in November, and if we get it through the legislature, and then a year to execute. Now, Norm, I'm sorry, am I listening to something else?
Yeah, actually, the vote, theoretically, as it's presented now, only the Rhinebeck section of the town of Rye would vote, only the town of Rye would vote.
Right, so, okay, so I just wanted to make it good. Thanks for clarifying that. So right now, that's right, of course, for the people in this room, as is currently configured, it would only be a town of Rye vote because there's no immediate impact on the town of Mamaroneck. The expectation is, if we were to move forward, is that effectively, the Rye, well, we're looking at the Rhinebeck section alternatives. And the more likely scenario looks like today is that the Rhinebeck would become effectively a paper town. So we talked about the Mamaroneck meeting effect. It looks like it would become a paper town. And in that scenario, there would be no vote involvement in the town of Mamaroneck. So we're finalizing that right now. That looks like the most likely scenario going forward. And then ultimately, the hope is that we would go co-terminus Portchester, Rybrook, and Rhinebeck would become its own town. Those are finalizing. We're in the steering committee trying to finalize the last proposal. So that sort of brings us up to where we are. I think, Carol, now we can leave it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The draft report, as you see, is pretty long, but you can read it online. We only have a few copies here. You're welcome to take those, first come, first serve. It is available on the website www. I think it's .cgr.org/Rye-Town. And on that website, you can access not only the draft report, but you can watch all the meetings that have transpired, and also you can put it in, there's a place for public comment on the process. So I just want to mention that. George, did you want to just briefly mention the historical coterminus
In terms of,
this area?
I'm sorry.
Mamaroneck Village, wasn't there a Mamaroneck
There was,
Village?
oh, this,
Yeah.
okay. There was an effort, now someone's going to tell me the number of years ago, but anyone remember what year it was? There was a vote on Mamaroneck Village becoming a coterminous town village. It would be named the Town of Mamaroneck Harbor. And for that to happen, it required both the people who live in Mamaroneck Village to decide they want to go, and for the portions of Rye Town and Mamaroneck Town that they would be willing to let them go. And the voters of Rye Town agreed to let them go, and the voters of Mamaroneck Town did not. And there's real reasons for that. In Mamaroneck Town, you have a significant tax base for the town budget that involves the businesses in Mamaroneck Village and the flats, as we call it, and then also a very heavy residential population in Orienta and Heathcote Hill, and areas where there's some real tax structures that would be lost to the town of Mamaroneck were the village of Mamaroneck to become a coterminous town. Also, the town center, which is the headquarters for town government, is physically in the village of Mamaroneck. And if the lines of the village of Mamaroneck were to become its own town, then you could not have the town center for one town physically in another town, which is a complication. Now, when the village of Rye became the city of Rye, and there was negotiation for that degree of secession, there were certain considerations made. I was obviously not present at the time. We read in retrospect what those situations were. We have no idea what the political dialogue was at that time. But Rye Town Park, which sits physically in the city of Rye and is run by a commission, is not controlled by the city of Rye, although it sits in the city of Rye. And if you're a resident of Portchester, that beach at Rye Town Park is the beach you have access to as a resident to go out to the Long Island Sound. Portchester does not have a beachfront that's appreciable. That was a consideration made when the village of Rye left. Another consideration was that the Rye town would continue to own a dock that leads out into Milton Harbor. Same reason, access to water, and there were other considerations made at the time. So in any consideration in the future between Mamaroneck Village and Mamaroneck Town, there would have to be negotiations at the very least over these things. But as I said, when you asked me about the coterminous, the vote did not pass in the town of Mamaroneck. So here's the bottom line. For Mamaroneck Village to become its own town village, voters in Portchester, Rybrook, Larchmont, unincorporated Mamaroneck Town, and Rye-Neck would all have a vote, because they would be part of a town that would be letting it go, as well as residents who would then be deciding to organize it. So that happened a number of years ago. By the way, there was a vote to merge the Rye-Neck and the Rye City school districts that failed in the city of Rye twice, in the 70s, I think late 70s and early 80s, or twice in the early 80s. So the concept, and Joe laid it out from a business standpoint, the mergers of Manufacturer Hanover and Chemical, and then later on the new Chemical with Chase. Those are business decisions made by business people who were looking out for the fiduciary interest of the entity. Here, you need the voting willingness of the population to do that. It's not just a fiduciary responsibility. It's how you view your community, how you view your economics, how you view other things. So it's a more complicated process, and that is a historical fact, I think.
The history in the village of Mamaroneck, actually, there have been 3 coterminous votes. They've all been turned down, clearly illustrated by what George just noted. It is a disadvantage to the unincorporated town of Mamaroneck for any section to secede for obvious reasons. It dilutes their economic base. The difference this time, however, is that there's an interest by the village of Larchmont in possibly investigating and themselves becoming a coterminous town village. This goes down to the pragmatic approach. Is it realistic? Do we want to have a vote just for the sake of having a vote? I don't think so. If the village of Mamaroneck, section of the town of Mamaroneck, and the residents of the village of Larchmont so choose to become a coterminous town, you have approximately 65 to 70% of the vote. So instead of having the same results as the last 3 coterminous votes, you have an excellent chance, nothing is guaranteed of course, of passing. However, as was discussed by the committee, there's a pragmatic approach. Instead of having a potential poison pill to the original idea, which would be the town of Mamaroneck, if I were the town of Mamaroneck, I would also wish to do that. But if only the town of Rye votes, that means the Rye-Neck section would become a town, Rybrook would become a town, and Portchester would become a town. The paper town of Rye-Neck, in essence, would mean that the village of Mamaroneck would have all the services done for the paper town. So there would be no interest in increasing any costs. There's also another factor when you look at it. According to New York State, it's not 100% yet. It will be up to state legislature, I believe, that the 3 independent towns, once they're created in town of Rye, will get up to almost $1 million a year in perpetuity, just for the fact that they've gone through this process. So that gives it a definite advantage. Of course, there are always wishes. Portchester would wish to become a city. That remains to be seen. But in all reality, so you understand this, Rye-Neck would become a paper town in this area. Rye-Neck, the town of Rye-Neck would use all the services of the village of Mamaroneck, because in the study, and I would note, the study itself does not give a recommendation. It's a compilation of all the facts of the 3 different municipalities, 4 actually, with the town of Rye. The village of Mamaroneck is fairly independent now, other than collecting tax dollars and interest from your mortgage. The village of Mamaroneck has all the services now. It has the fire department, it has DPW, it has all the services. So that in itself, the village of Mamaroneck actually would do that. And that would be the first step theoretically, because if Larchmont in fact does go ahead and they accept the fact that they chose to be a town village, then you would have the entire, the majority of the village that is in the town of Mamaroneck voting along with Larchmont. So these are just some scenarios that's in there. But again, it's up to, it is up to us. And I think Ann wants to go next.
Thank you. Ann McAndrews, Mayor of Larchmont.
Thank you, Norm. We are in, I'm mayor of the village of Larchmont, and we've always been part of the town of Mamaroneck, historically. In recognition of the complexity of this situation for the village of Larchmont, I asked 3 of our residents who are very knowledgeable to study it for us, for me and our board. 2 members are already here, former Mayor Josh Mandel and former trustee Ned Benton. The word interest is a strong one, sir, in becoming a separate town village for the village of Larchmont. It's something that, of course, in the scenario of things we have to look at and we will look at, but it's an interesting question that is just being examined now and has to be examined in the cosmos of the question. So no report has been made by, I call my alumni, reporting to the village, and it's an interesting question. It's a very interesting question because the thought is that it isn't so much the layers of government, but the similarity of government and the services that are given, plus the potential for more consolidation of services, in addition to the consolidation of governmental units. But it's an intriguing question. It's a question that we're going forward with looking at. But to put it bluntly, I wouldn't hang my hat on it quite yet, Norm. So thank you very much.
Nancy Seligson, Town of Mamaroneck Supervisor.
Good morning, everyone. I wanted to thank Joe and George also for giving the background information of this study. And I have read the study in detail, and it is a really good study. I agree with you. And it is a study for the dissolution of the town of Rye. It does not study the change of the town of Mamaroneck or dissolution of the town of Mamaroneck. And it is a really good study in looking at the dissolution of the town of Rye and how that can be accomplished. And I agree that that's probably a noble cause. The town of Rye provides very few services for the villages there, and it is a layer of government that seems at this point in time could probably be eradicated and make sense. However, that does have implications for the town of Mamaroneck if the village of Mamaroneck chose to become a coterminous town village. That has not been studied, and that isn't studied in this report. The situations that would change, the impact on the village of Mamaroneck, the impact on the town of Mamaroneck, the impact on the village of Larchmont, because the town of Mamaroneck has a very fluid and cooperative relationship with both the village of Mamaroneck and the village of Larchmont. You know, I always talk about the 3 municipalities as really being one community. And we share a lot of services, and shared services is a huge part of that report. And what struck me in reading the report is that in almost every case in discussing shared services, the opening paragraph says that due to the geographic separation of the village of Mamaroneck compared to the other municipalities, there's very limited opportunities for increased shared services. And then it says, but there's increased opportunities with the town of Mamaroneck. And that is something that we already enjoy, is a lot of shared services among our 3 municipalities. I think there's a lot more opportunity for more shared opportunities. And the services could be enhanced, and the services could be more efficient and effective, thereby saving money for the 3 municipalities. I also want to remind everyone that the bulk of our big tax nut for all of us is not the municipal tax component. The municipal tax component is about 20% of your tax bill, and you are getting a huge array of services for that. So, you know, Connecticut's taxes are so much lower because their state actually organizes their taxes very differently. And the school taxes are not included in that property tax. So I would certainly be in favor of further study and looking at what the opportunities would be and how the changes in the town of Mamaroneck would occur, and the village of Larchmont and the village of Mamaroneck if the Village of Mamaroneck wants to look at creating its own coterminous town village. But I just want to say that I think there's many, many elements here that have yet to be studied in detail and analyzed properly of what that would mean for us. I don't want to hold up the change in the town of Rye because that clearly has been studied for many years and seems to be a serious goal and wanted by all the people involved, and that makes a lot of sense to me. Also, one final thing is that it's funny to look at all these studies and see that they're actually creating more separate municipalities when the idea, of course, in thinking and along with the banking metaphor, and I used to work for Chemical Bank, was to consolidate and make them larger so that they could be more efficient and save money. So I just want to remind people that, as George pointed out, the towns were here a really long time ago. We celebrated our 350th anniversary in the town of Mamaroneck 2 years ago. It's very exciting. And I just learned that the state of New York incorporated the town of Mamaroneck 225 years ago, and so we might have a little celebration for that too. But that the towns were originally conceived as the larger entities, and that in our situation with the unincorporated town of Mamaroneck, Village of Larchmont, and Village of Mamaroneck, all three municipalities provide serious day-to-day services to our residents. And I think there are greater opportunities for shared services among the three of us. So I'm interested to, look more into the changes and how they could affect all of us. But I think there's a lot more study to be done in that particular area.
Thank you, Nancy. Mayor Pelham? We have about 15 minutes, and I'd like to open it for questions.
Sure, I'll be brief. When we started this, I'm Dennis Pill, I'm the mayor of Portchester. Thank you for inviting me, and I want to thank you guys for holding this forum. I think it's really vital to good government in general, right? When we started this discussion, I'll go over here so you guys don't have my back. I don't bother your back. When we started this discussion a couple of years ago, as Joe mentioned, he wanted to merge Rye Town, Rye Brook, Portchester, Rye City, Rye Neck, secede from New York, go a part of Connecticut. Mayor Feinstein and Rye Brook wanted to be left alone. Portchester wanted to become a city. So everybody had different visions in mind of what's best for their local municipality. And if you look at the reality of consolidation in the history of New York State, Governor Cuomo, it began when he was the Attorney General, he was pushing for village dissolution and economizing on the scale, eliminate layers of government, so you'd have fewer layers of government. 29 out of 30 failed the votes, right? So there's what's practical and there's what's politically palatable, right? But when you look at the numbers, right, the numbers are interesting. Rye Brook, 8,000 people. It's the smallest independent entity within the town of Rye. They have the cheapest cost for their village taxes per capita of all of the entities within the town of Rye. So that kind of defies the logic. Well, wait a minute. How could the smallest entity have the, which has no economy of scale, achieve the lowest cost of government? And it really comes down to sharing services. By way of my background, I've built shared service centers for some pretty big corporations. Time Warner, Time, Life, People, Sports Illustrated, Fortune, Money, Time Life Books, Warner Books, all independent brands, all independent franchises, all separate legal corporations. They share one back office for all the back office stuff that nobody cares about, right? And when you look at how these village dissolution votes have failed, it's all about what's politically palatable. Everybody wants the school mascot. Everybody wants their logo on the police car. And everybody wants what I'll call decision autonomy. The zoning and land use and policy decisions that the village of Rye Brook has to make, that the village of Mamaroneck has to make, are much different than the zoning and land use and policy decisions that the more urban village of Portchester needs to make, right? Now, if you look at the cost of government, that's free. You don't pay your zoning board, you don't pay your planning board, and you really don't pay your board of trustees a whole lot, right? In Rye Brook, it's free. I don't even want the money, but it's cheap. It's $100 a week for the trustees, and I don't know what they make in Mamaroneck, but the study bears this out. Where the opportunities are is in sharing services. Why Rye Brook has the cheapest cost of government is because they've combined with the Village of Portchester to share the fire department, to share the ambulance, to share the library system, right? So I would suggest you can have your cake and eat it too, right? You can have the decision autonomy that has really evolved from the history, as Senator Latimer has pointed out, right? And having government closer to people and having, your unique circumstances dealt with while we share services. We can keep the Village of Rye Brook, keep the Village of Portchester, but just by combining, I'll call it a back office element, but it's really not. Police dispatch, for instance, we could save about $600,000 a year. That's $600,000 is 3% on the tax rate in the Village of Portchester. Now it'd have to be split, so it's not quite that. But if you see my point, right? So this is a practical approach to get there. Sharing services where the cost efficiencies are. The layering makes sense. If you look at the town of Rye, no disrespect, no value added to the Village of Portchester. There's no value added. No, they don't. Right? And in fact, it becomes an impediment. We have special assessment districts, sidewalk improvement programs. When somebody's grass is too high, we want to cut we have to cut it for them. We want to put it on their tax bill. We can't. We have to talk about that, by the way, because they do the limits, right? So if you want to have an alignment of strategy that goes along with this local decision autonomy, delayering the government makes sense, right? And that's pretty much it. Yeah. So it makes a lot of sense. The paper town makes a lot of sense because the Rye Neck situation, a lot of permutations, combinations, and Supervisor Selleck said it well. That's a whole different study unto itself and a different opportunity.
Thank you so much for your input. Appreciate it. Assemblyman Otis, would you care to speak? Put you on the spot.
No, I was a mayor for 12 years, and so these issues actually are maybe not for most people here. They're enjoyable for me to work on issues like this and to work with George and Joe and all the mayors and supervisors to try and find a solution and make something happen. There are two pieces of this I think are worth focusing on. One, and it's been mentioned by both of our main speakers, how do we provide services? How do we provide them efficiently? And there's certainly a burden all the time to reevaluate all these structures and find ways to do things more effectively. Why the town of Rye is a great opportunity to make one of these moves is because the town of Rye has no unincorporated areas. Before Rye Brook was created, the unincorporated area of the town of Rye is what is now Rye Brook, and there was no village there. The town of Rye provided services. When the village of Rye Brook was created, the town of Rye no longer provided those services. So there's a logic to trying to find a way to work this through. It is complex, and I think that this has been alluded to by a number of speakers, but to give you a little example, we have a court function of the town of Rye. We have a police function that would have to be sorted out. Well, we don't have a police function, actually, because the villages all do their own police, but we have two parks. We have the tax assessment. We have Rye Town Park and Crawford Park. We have the Rye Neck section, which we think we maybe have a way to address that without slowing this whole process up. So it's interesting. There's a lot of work to be done, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. I think that this is something that we need first a consensus from the local governments, and we're working on that. And then George and I can try and basically see if we can make this happen in terms of Albany. But this is a lot more complex than your typical village dissolution. Typically, you may have a village or two in upstate they want to dissolve, and as Dennis mentioned, most of these have been rejected by the voters, but it's sort of like we're going to close down this village and incorporate basically as part of the town. In New York State, every piece of real estate in New York State has to be part of a town or a city. You can't just have a freestanding village, which is sort of one of the pieces that creates a problem in putting the puzzle together. I think we can get something done, but there's a lot of detail that needs to be worked out. But it is ultimately about how do you want your services provided. I think Dennis said it well in terms of people do like their local autonomy, they like to know that the people on their village board basically are people that they know that they can go to when something happens, and which is why the trend around the state has been to be slow on dissolving villages per se, and that seems to be where the track is going here. But I'm actually very excited about being able to work on this with all the local officials. Hopefully we can make something happen. It's actually fun, and we can have something good happen out of it and set an example for other parts of the state. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We now have just a brief moment for questions from the audience. Please keep your questions as brief as possible. Okay, France?
Thank you. I want to thank everybody who's spoken today. Quite frankly, my head is spinning. I'm really glad that I don't have to vote on this thing. How in the world are you going to go about educating the people who will be responsible for voting, so they know, other than what you say it's good or bad, so they understand the importance and the direction that vote should take?
Sure.
Could you repeat the question, please? Just repeat the question.
Sure. How are we going to educate the people on this momentous vote, I think is the question. And the answer is, look, it's like any initiative you undertake that's different in your community. We're working very hard to do that. So we've had several public meetings. We had a public meeting with all the steering committee, open to the whole of the town of Rye. Each of the individual municipalities has held a public meeting. Mamaroneck did that specifically for the village of Mamaroneck. The village of Rye Brook's done it. The town of Rye's done that specific, and then I know Dorchester's about to do that. So we're doing it in that fashion. Obviously, on the website, in newspapers, there's been discussion in the newspaper. So we're doing everything at our using everything at our disposal to try and get the word out. Again, each of the boards, each of the municipalities is trying to do that separately. So it's in the same way that Mayor Pillow communicates with the village of Portchester, Mayor Rosenblum, the village of Mamaroneck, we're trying to get it out at every different level, and obviously ourselves from the town of Rye. But it is important, it's important that you tell your neighbors. And we have a report, it's online, it's available in our offices, and we're available 24/7 to answer questions as everybody in the steering committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Ooh, yes.
Oversubscribed order for the vote, and if it fails in one, does that end it?
Yes, so the question is, oh, sorry. Yeah, this is, now you know why 29 out of 30 have failed. It's a horrifically cumbersome process. Senator Latimer talked about the exchange of change. And I would just add one slight modification to that. So if I've got 70 cents and you've got 30 cents, the logic is you're incented to work with me and I'm not. However, if we both reduce our costs, if we both reduce our taxes, and the goal here then is to generate the win-win, to incent the 70 cents to merge with the 30 cents. And that's ultimately, and again, we have to look out going forward. I mean, every one of these municipal officials will tell you their health costs, pension benefits have tripled in the last year, so we really need to, each one of us is hugely incented to reduce the number of employees. But ultimately, yes, so the way it's going to work is each of the 4 boards has to vote in favor. If any one of those 4 boards votes against, it doesn't move forward. If it moves forward on the 4 boards, we then go to the legislature, we turn it over to Mr. Otis and Mr. Latimer. They'll try and secure support from the legislature, home rule legislation. If we can draft legislation, we then go to take it to referendum in November. And then each of the 4 municipalities would have to approve. So the village of Portchester would have to be fully in favor. The village of Rye Brook would have to be fully in favor. The town of Rye would have to vote. And the village of Mamaroneck have to vote. I'm sorry, no, I apologize. Sorry. The other 3, I apologize, yes. Right, so the municipalities would have to be in favor. So ultimately, and I guess just the Rye next section would have to be in favor. So you're right, sorry, I apologize. The town of Mamaroneck wouldn't vote, and the village of Mamaroneck would be the Rye next section of the town of Mamaroneck for that. So each of the affected municipalities would have to be supported as well.
I'm sorry, would you clarify that, please?
Yeah, apologize, sorry. So, well, first of all, we're finalizing the legislations, but the expectation is anybody impacted by this would vote. So the village of Portchester would have to vote for it. The village of Rye Brook would have to vote for it. The town of Rye would have to vote for it, each majority votes. And the Rye next section of the Village of Mamaroneck would have to vote. Thank you for clarifying. The Rhinebeck section, the Village of Mamaroneck would have to vote to accept the change.
But if one of those entities voted no, it would do the whole
My
thing, or is it a
understanding-
total vote of the?
No,
Can I
please, yes,
continue?
please.
The last meeting that we had,
Right.
in which I offered the concept that what you're doing actually is Portchester Village is seceding from the town, and Rye Brook Village is seceding from the town. That's really what the vote would be if you structure it that way. They are standalone votes of secession. So if the overall town of Rye voters, which would be all three communities, Rhinebeck, Portchester, Rye Brook, agree, and if either of the two villages votes in favor of secession, that village can secede. If both villages vote to secede, then those two communities would be out of the town of Rye. The town of Rye then would shrink to be a wraparound town only for only for the section of Rhinebeck. The point being that it depends on how you structure this. If you structure this as Portchester makes a determination on its future to secede from the town of Rye, it mirrors what the village of Rye did in 1941. And if Rye Brook has the same vote, then it mirrors what happened in 1941. They secede as separate entities. They become then their own town villages. And then it leaves Rhinebeck left in the town of Rye, and then you shrink the town of Rye service and structure to a different model, which would be, really just a paper model. And that gets you through, quote unquote, phase one. Phase two being the discussion about the future of Larchmont Village, Mamaroneck Town, Mamaroneck Village, including the Rhinebeck section.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Nora?
So my question is, my name is Nora Lucas, and my question is, if we dissolve the town of Rye, leaving a paper town in Rhinebeck, obviously Rhinebeck is going to have potentially all of the liabilities, the tax liabilities that the town of Rye has now, which are,
Not necessarily.
well, and number two,
Can't hear down here.
and number two, the whole conversation is about sharing services, but this first vote is not about sharing services. This first vote accomplishes nothing in the realm of shared services. Is that fair to say?
Well, let me take a quick crack and then George.
Just repeat the question.
So two questions. How do you allocate the liabilities, and what is this? How does this impact shared service? Well, let me take the second one first because that's easier. There's no impact on shared services. The hope is the dissolution of the town of Rye encourages villages to come together and share. There's nothing stopping them from doing it today. And there also is a 1-year execution plan period. So if the vote were to take place in November, and we did dissolve the town of Rye, there's a 1 year to pull together an execution plan. Hopefully, during that period, the villages would be incented to accelerate sharing services. What would happen is both Rye Brook and Portchester would have to provide assessment services, which they don't currently provide. They'd have to provide tax collection services. They'd have to pick up those services. The hope would be they'd work together to provide that as a single entity, but that's still to be worked out. So there's no sharing service on day one. In terms of liabilities, again, George, you're probably better suited. Well, good.
Nora, the questions of what the town of Rye owns, operates, and has responsibility for would be discussed with the villages before the secession would happen. For example, Crawford Park. Crawford Park sits in the village of Rye Brook. It was deeded to the town of Rye by the woman who owned the property. You'd have to look legally at the construct of that and determine legally whether that responsibility could be given from the town of Rye to the town village of Rye Brook, the new entity. Rye Brook would have to be willing to take it on. The court would have to determine that this was consistent with the wishes of the owner of the property. And if that were to be accomplished, then that would not be a liability that falls on the back of the paper town of Rye Town, left wrapping around Rhinebeck. The village has responsibility for certain bridges. Now, Jefferson Avenue Bridge is a bridge in the town of Rye that is also in the village of Rhinebeck, so that liability would stay with the town of Rye wrapped around Rhinebeck. If there's a similar bridge, I can't think of one off the top of my head, elsewhere in the town of Rye that borders another town, then that would have to become the responsibility of the new town village, either of Rye Brook or Portchester, and that would have to be negotiated out and identified. In the same ways I described earlier, when the city of Rye, the village of Rye seceded from the town of Rye in the 40s, there were decisions made about Rye Town Dock, Rye Town Park. What would happen with Rye Town Park and the commission that governs that, probably a separate piece of state legislation. that we would have to deal with because that was incorporated in a certain way. Would have to be reincorporated. It's very complicated. Steve said it very accurately. It's very complicated stuff when we get down to the legalities of it. The bottom line, I suspect, is whatever the town's obligations are currently in the Rye section of the town would remain the obligations of the town of Rye having shrunken to Rye. The obligations of the town of Rye that currently fit in either Rybrook or Portchester would most likely be devolved to the town village of Portchester, the town village of Rybrook, and would have to be identified in the ultimate language that creates the referendum to secede.
Yes, hold on one second.
I'm Bruce Shearer, and I just want to thank everybody. This is an incredible session. Many of you have been here before on other subjects. The summit is 10 years old, more than 10 years. We've been gathering here once a month to hear issues. And a number of you have been on the programs before. And I have to say, this is by far the most complicated issue. And my reaction to all this, and I just think it's worth giving a reaction back to all we've heard, is that this will take a citizens' council of some sort of volunteer group across all these jurisdictions, people who can really have a reputation of advocating for the community good. They can sort through this. The education question for me is the core of this. This isn't going to wouldn't get by me. So I don't have at all the grasp after spending this time with you, and that's pretty precious time we've had. So my own feeling is that it's a great thing to pursue. The summit has been interested in consolidation for 10 years or more. We've discussed it repeatedly. This is the biggest proposal that's come up. And is there some way we can gather a group of citizens beyond the political actors who can kind of work in step with you and make this a 3-year process and look at consolidation of services, as you said, Supervisor Sullivan, more broadly? And I think that's really the feedback that I feel would be useful from this group. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Anyone else? Well, the time has come to say goodbye. This is a very complex, we just, crammed a 3-hour, easily, symposium on consolidation into an hour. I want to thank our speakers, Town Supervisor Joe Carvin and State Senator George Latimer. Let's give them a round of applause.